Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to SFF180. Thomas here, your host as always. Thank you for joining me. I had been on the fence about whether I wanted to do another video commemorating my 20th anniversary year reviewing SFF online. And then my good friend Rachel from Shades of Orange pops up and says, hey, why don't you do a favorites video? Not a bad idea, but, believe it or not, despite what you might think about how reading and reviewing for 20 years might make it super easy to assemble all these comprehensive top 10 lists, and maybe for some people it would be. I actually find this kind of thing difficult. For one thing, my list of favorite books is very fluid, right? I might lose my appreciation for a book after many years have passed, and I've had a chance to read better books. I might rethink a book I read long ago and didn't like, and decide it might have been better than I thought it was. But of course, that doesn't mean that I can't take a minute to mull over some titles that sculpted my personal reading journey through life, right? About 4 years ago, I attempted to do a video on this very topic, SFF favorites, and I ended up rambling for about 17 minutes, less about the books than my own musings on the passage of time and how we often drift away from people and things in our lives that were once meaningful to us in search of new things. Probably a little disappointing to my viewers who were expecting just a basic top 10 list to fill up their TBRs. Sorry. So for this video, I plan to stay a little more on point. But I will say a couple of things first about what reviewing for all these years has taught me about myself and who I am as a reader, as well as, some observations about the state of book criticism on today's internet, right? Because I chose to get into reviewing expressly because I wanted to be a better reader. I discovered that if I read a book by an author completely new to me, somebody that I've never read before, and I don't like it, I'm no less likely to read a second book by that same author than I would be if I had loved the first book. For one thing, unlike some reviewers, I do not like to DNF or give up easily. I want to give an author plenty of chances to prove me wrong or to prove me right. I mean, there definitely are a few situations where I've decided after only one or two books that a certain writer is not or never will be for me, right? But there have been other times when a writer I simply failed to connect with on my first attempt ended up becoming a personal favorite. Also, I grew up, obviously, reading the works of earlier generations, probably unlike a lot of you did. And so the whole exercise for me of growing and becoming hopefully more enlightened over time and rethinking my values and expanding my tastes has not caused me to abandon the past wholesale, right? It has simply given me the ability to appreciate older work within the context of cultural changes in history and thus construct my critiques accordingly. I am definitely a man with opinions on the subject of the current state of book criticism, especially whenever the subject of older books comes up as it exists online, especially on social media. But now's not the time for that. So let's get going. Here are some of the SFF books that have impacted me the most as a reader down through the years. This is a sprawling list featuring titles from all over the speculative fiction map, with both past and present titles. Some of these you might like, others not so much. Some of them you're going to be like, what's that, right? But I mean, that's what it's all about, isn't it? Now, to get the ball rolling, let me start with a couple of obvious, well-known classics. Yes, The Lord of the Rings will always be one of the most impactful and important reading experiences of my life. No, it's not as if there weren't plenty of other fantasy series being published when I was a kid, but this trilogy, for better or worse, has basically always been the gateway drug, right, for secondary world epic fantasy for many generations of readers now, right? So read this one, and you're pretty much ready for anything that follows. And of course, Dune, which is primed to gain an entirely new generation of readers due to the upcoming movie. It is a touchstone novel in the history of science fiction, marrying action-adventure on an epic scale to salient social-political commentary. But I have to say, this is one where you would probably do just fine sticking with the original novel and ignoring pretty much everything that came after. Frank Herbert still had some good ideas to bring to this universe. For one thing, after spending all of the first book building up a chosen one savior protagonist in Paul Atreides, the entire second book, Dune Messiah, is dedicated to tearing him down completely. But Herbert never again quite captured a sandstorm in a bottle the way he did with the original. And the less said about the current generation of prequels and sequels and spin-offs, the better. Now, I started reading SF when I was a little kid, little Thomas, and so of course there's a lot I don't remember about those stories, but I do remember that the very first science fiction story I ever read was this classic children's book by Alexander Key, Rivets and Sprockets, about a couple of boy robots who go to Mars and presumably do cool things on Mars. I mean, I don't remember anything at all about the story. I was 7. But I do remember that to second grade Thomas, this book was life-changing. I'm pretty sure I kept checking it out of my school library on an endless loop. Now, I only just recently discovered that this book was part of a series. And in the next book, Rivets and Sprockets get their own little robot doggy named Bolts, which would have melted my 7-year-old mind if I had read it back then. So because this was clearly the favorite book of a very small version of me many, many years ago, then it deserves a place on this list. On to another classic from my childhood, Richard Adams' sublime and heart-wrenching masterpiece, Watership Down, was another book that had the kind of lasting impact that turns a young reader into a lifelong reader. Though I wouldn't call it fantasy so much as an example of a modern-day fable, about a family of rabbits who must abandon their warren and undertake a perilous odyssey across the Hampshire countryside to find a new home. Along the way, we get a story that raises our awareness about our responsibilities to the stewardship of the land we live in and the other creatures we share it with. It's powerful and poetic and scary and unflinching about life's dangers. Another series I discovered at a young age was Susan Cooper's incredible Dark is Rising sequence. The entire 5-book series is fantastic, but I think the first 2 books especially, Over Sea Under Stone and The Dark is Rising, are exceptional. And The Dark is Rising is not only the best middle-grade Arthurian fantasy you'll ever read, I'd be willing to call it one of the best Arthurian fantasy novels ever published, period. Now, moving on into my adulthood reading. The Book of the New Sun is a 4-volume series by the late legendary Gene Wolfe that belongs to a long tradition in SFF called the Dying Earth story, and it may be considered a precursor to Grimdark. It's a difficult and challenging series set in the far distant future, when the sun is cooling and human civilization is in its twilight. And it's all about a disgraced torturer who is forced into a life of wandering through the Commonwealth, which exists in what used to be the South American continent. It's a complex, sometimes bewildering narrative with an unlikable and unreliable narrator, and it's often been described as a huge puzzle that requires careful and attentive reading to figure out, although I think that might be overstating the case a little bit. But the more I think about it, it definitely has kinship with a book like Black Leopard, Red Wolf. Demanding, definitely not for the faint of heart, but very rewarding for anybody ready to rise to the challenge. Now later this year, I am planning an episode of SFF180 Classics about this series, and I will review it in much more detail then. Speaking of difficult work, I guess I better get this next one out of the way. Okay, is anybody out there still not in the loop about what a steaming pile of racist garbage H.P. Lovecraft was? Because I think that discussion is pretty well out there by now. One of the unpleasant realities that nearly all of us as fans have to deal with at one point or another in our lives is the discovery that someone who has created art that we love and that has profoundly impacted us is, or was, an absolute toxic waste spill of a human being. An entire generation of readers is currently processing those emotions right now. I've definitely had more than one reckoning with artistic heroes of my youth. The whole notion of the death of the artist, where you settle yourself into a place of equilibrium between loving the art and letting go of the person, is a thing we all have to settle for ourselves. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to that problem that will satisfy everybody. Sometimes you can hit that equilibrium. Sometimes you just can't, and you have to let both the art and the artist go. But how we choose is something that we each have to determine individually. In the case of Lovecraft, yeah, I mean, I honestly don't think I would have ever wanted to meet him, or even be in the same room with him. But I will always love his fiction. I even love the things about his fiction everyone else loves to hate, like his ever so literary and dense prose, which Neil Gaiman has correctly noted is a style that is very easy and very pleasant to parody. There simply is no more timeless and influential a body of work in modern horror, except for Poe. And no, it's not the kind of writing that's for everyone, but I've gotten hours of enjoyment out of it, and I'm sure that I will continue to. Too bad he was such a fucking asshole. Now, if you'd like your cosmic horror without the side order of asshole, Richard Paul Russo's 2001 novel Ship of Fools combines both cosmic horror and generation ship space opera into a philosophically rich and multi-layered story that juggles a number of themes while offering the kind of slow burn tension I absolutely live for. It also has the single most frightening alien derelict in SF history. This is one that holds its edge after multiple readings. Speaking of space opera, since most of you probably know it's my personal favorite subgenre of science fiction, if I had to pick two contemporary space opera series that have made the most impression on me, I'd boil it down to these two. Ian M. Banks' Culture novels and Alastair Reynolds' Inhibitor series, which satisfy any science fiction fan's craving for big ideas unfolding on a vast intergalactic stage. Banks is no longer with us, sadly, but Reynolds is launching a brand new trilogy in the Inhibitor universe this very summer, and I have definitely cleared my calendar. Interestingly, Reynolds is one of those authors that I mentioned earlier, where I had an initially negative first impression, and then eventually grew to realize I'd discovered a new favorite author. Revelation Space was a very difficult nut for me to crack the first time I tried reading it, possibly because it broke a lot of rules, and it wasn't like any space opera I had read before. But once I was willing to meet it on its own terms, whoa. Switching gears now, China Mieville's Perdido Street Station remains a uniquely electrifying tour de force of the new weird, a shadowy masterpiece set in a city-state of humans and non-humans and more than a few monsters. If you like world building, this one has more of that going on than several entire series. Switching gears yet again. An underappreciated author I think deserves a much wider audience is Robert Charles Wilson, who is probably best known for his Hugo-winning novel Spin, which admittedly is something of a modern classic in the field. But I've always appreciated Wilson's versatility as a storyteller, and for my money, his masterpiece bar none has got to be Julian Comstock, a story of 22nd century America. It takes place in the years following civilization's collapse, in which the former United States is under a theocratic government that suppresses knowledge of all recent history about the secular ancients, and technology has reverted to something kind of like the mid to late 1800s. In other words, Wilson has created a story set in the near future that reads like alternate history, all about how little people manage to learn, even with the most noble intentions, from the mistakes of the past. It's all about how so-called great figures in history aren't born, they are made with an enormous and effective propaganda apparatus helping to build their mythology. It's a sweeping story of ambition, turning into egomania, turning into folly. Exactly the kind of book you read and you think, wow, I need the Netflix series right now. A story of enormous power is the great Octavia Butler's dystopian Earthseed duology, which was such a terrifyingly prescient saga that the first book, Parable of the Sower, features an autocratic presidential candidate whose campaign slogan literally is, "Make America Great Again." This is a book published in 1993. These novels were the capstone of an already illustrious career, and Butler died prematurely before getting to complete a proposed third novel. But in a true case of cosmic justice, Parable of the Sower finally became a New York Times bestseller in 2020, 27 years after it first came out. Gee, Thomas, it seems like all you enjoy is gloomy, dark shit. Not necessarily true. For instance, there's this. Terry Pratchett's Discworld is an institution, and with good reason. No other humorist could possibly combine fantasy with pure whimsy to create a series with such rich characters, so much endless humor, and often blistering social commentary the way Terry Pratchett did over the course of 40 wonderful books. Now, every fan of the series has their favorites, of course, but I would rank Small Gods, as well as most of the later novels featuring Commander Vimes of the Night Watch, as indisputable masterpieces. Small Gods has the single most chef's kiss ending I've ever read in a book. Now, when it comes to literary SFF, I confess I haven't loved everything I've read by Japanese superstar Haruki Murakami, but Kafka on the Shore is a sublime story that has a way of leaving your heart feeling drained and then wrung out and then filled up again. People say Murakami does magical realism, but I don't like to use that term myself, mainly because I think everyone overuses it to mean like anything slightly weird. When the fact is, magical realism was a literary movement specific to Latin American fiction. What Murakami does is slipstream fiction, walking the tightrope between fantasy and reality without ever setting a firm foot in either one or the other. I mean, I guess that's also what magical realism does, but Murakami's stories just always feel like he's, just doing his own thing. Kafka on the Shore deals with metaphysical questions of memory and identity with a satirical eye towards popular culture. Also cats. Lots of cats. Okay, this has been a long video already, so I'll wrap it up with a quick note about the most recent work in SFF that I'm willing to consider favorites. Naturally, there is N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy. Probably the first piece of work SFF has produced in the 21st century that I predict will be regarded as a canonical genre classic, still being talked about 50, 60, 70 years from now. The way the Foundation trilogy or the Earthsea trilogy are still talked about today. Arkady Martine has produced space opera of lasting merit in her remarkable Tx-Kalan duology. And last but not least, frankly, if you don't think Martha Wells' Murderbot Diaries are the most fun you could ever have with a neurotic security android, then you're just a big old duty poopy head. So there it is. A big list of some of the SFF novels that have become lasting favorites among all the books I have read and reviewed over several decades. No. So if you made it all the way to the end of this video, then thanks for watching. Light up those comments, leave a like, share the video far and wide with all of your SFF reading friends, and above all, please subscribe. If you have not done so, that is how the channel grows. You can also support the channel at my TeePublic store and at my Patreon, where recruits into Wink's Army get little perks like early access on some of my videos. I use the Patreon money to pay Matt Olson, my incredible channel artist, for all of the lovely thumbnails and other related artwork that he does for me. So again, thank you to my Patreons for that support. I want to thank all the rest of you guys for being the very best viewers in all of BookTube. And until I see all of you next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and happy reading.